We'll start here with our title. Of course, Puerto Rican heritage, a blending of cultures, which we are celebrating in honor of Puerto Rican Heritage and Latino Heritage Month. Um, Again, we're the Southern California chapter of the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women. You could see the address there, and Marie can also post the address if you're interested on looking at our website. Um, we did our best in this presentation to represent the various cultural influences that are part of our culture, to give a broad picture. We can't go into a lot of detail in an hour, but to give you at least some information you may already know, or something new. I know we've learned a lot from being in the process of just building this presentation of how we became a nation as Puerto Rican people, and to continue to explore our roots. We used various sources, and we thank and honor the sources of information that we accessed, and we try to represent them in our reference page in the end with some links throughout the presentation as well. And we apologize for any oversights that we may have made. So we hope you enjoy this presentation and that it inspires you to learn more about our Puerto Rican culture.
All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Marjorie, as Anaida presented me earlier, introduced me earlier. For tonight, we are basically really celebrating the Puerto Rican heritage, our Puerto Rican heritage. And our goal for tonight is to highlight the contributions of three distinctive cultures in which actually became our own culture. And we're going to see that through our history and culture, music, dance, arts and crafts, and language. And I'm sure that you all are going to enjoy a lot of the things that we're going to present, and they're going to be all very dear to your heart. So now we'll leave you with Anaida again.
Actually, you
Oh, sorry. Sorry. All right. So what do we have here? This is what we have here is a timeline of the encountering of the different cultures that today we recognize as Puerto Ricans. As you can see in this timeline, this blending of culture really spans over 400 years and beyond. It's a true evidence of the richness of our culture from the 1400s to the 1800s and beyond. Yeah, thank you, Anaya. Well, we didn't want to leave an important aspect of the background of what we will be presenting you. So it's worth noting that some of the highlights of the political environment throughout the same period that I just mentioned before, some of which had a tremendous influence in the evolution of our culture, especially after the encounter with the Spaniards. And you can see here in this particular slide that we have from the beginning of the colonization or of the encounter in 1493 all the way to the present times that we went through the Spanish War, the Spanish-American War, and we had the Jones Act where we Puerto Ricans acquired the the U.S. citizenship and so on.
That was my phone. I'm sorry. That was.
So what I just highlighted for you is the tone of the historical and political foundation that ultimately unleashed how so many cultures became one in Puerto Rico or for Puerto Rico. And with that, I'm going to leave you with Anna.
So we begin with our history of the Tainos. The Taino people were Arawak people who originated from the area of Venezuela and came up through the islands and occupied not only Puerto Rico, but what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti and parts of Cuba. And they had a particular language rooted in the Arawak language, and a way of life also that started there. And they also evolved in different ways when they started living and developing their culture on the islands. Primarily, they were farmers and also fishermen and women. The women also played a very important role in fishing. And throughout this presentation, we're going to highlight women because we're also a women's organization. So you'll see that we try to point out the role of women in important ways. Their religion was based on spiritism. They did believe that every individual had a spirit, and it was represented by a semi, which is a three-coned stone that you'll see a little bit later on. Their music, dance, and instruments are still reflected in ours today, but it played a very important role in their particular culture and that culture in the past, as it does today for us. And you'll hear more about the music, dance, and the instruments of Puerto Rico as well. The foods, flora, and fauna, and the language influence our culture today, and we see some remnants of those words that still resonate with us and that are part of the Taino language, not only in Spanish but actually in many languages throughout the world, because after the encounter, that language began to be used as they learned about the foods of the islands and of Mexico and other cultures that were encountered, and took them to Europe. So it really changed the language of the world in many ways. They were enslaved by the Spanish after the encounter. Initially, it was a friendly encounter, but then later on, once the Spanish knew that there was gold and that this was like a rich land, there was exploitation of that because Spain had undergone an 800-year war with the Moors, and so they were looking for gold. They were looking for opportunity to enrich themselves, and they did, certainly after not only Puerto Rico, but of course the other islands, Mexico, Peru, which was much more expansive in terms of the amount of gold and other precious stones and materials that they had. But initially, it was with the encounters with the islands that they first came, which were with the Tainos. Of course, once they knew, they fought back against the Spanish. Many really pushed back on that repression that they were experiencing. Unfortunately, because of the cruelty and because of diseases that were brought from Europe, many of the Tainos died. I mean, the population was reduced drastically from several million to several thousand. It was, in fact, considered a genocide, much like other indigenous populations in the Americas. Uh, we still have DNA from the female Taina primarily more than the male because they've done tests, and many of the Spaniards came alone, the men came alone, and so they took a lot of the Taina women for themselves as wives or sometimes under rape. Others, they actually got married. So it just depended on the situation. And so we maintain that matrilineal DNA. Many Puerto Ricans have at least 10-12%, which kind of takes them back to those early periods of the 1500s and early 1600s. So but we maintain that cultural heritage as well in the way that we live, and we'll try to highlight those pieces for you today. There is a more recent effort to revitalize the Taino people because we do feel like we are still Taino in ourselves and in our hearts, and there are people who feel much more strongly about it and are actually revitalizing some of the practices and celebrations today. You can see in this next picture, you could see in this next picture some elements of the heritage. This is the Yucayeque with the town with the bohíos that were round, and quite a few families lived in those, or family members. The rectangular one was for the cacique or the chief of the particular group or area. And down on the second picture, you could see once the Spaniards came, the enslavement of the Tainos. However, the rebellion is shown here on the left, where they discovered that Spaniards were not gods, that they could die, and so the rebellions were able to be more common. They did attempt to become free. We have elements of things that we still love that are very much from the Tainos, like the hammock. Even the word hammock. It comes from hamaca, and we'll learn more about the many different words that we use that come from the Taino, as well as the instruments that you'll learn about more, like the guiro. We have foods like the pimiento achiote and many others that we still eat today. And of course, the petroglyphs, which were the drawings on stone that the Tainos practiced as symbols for, like the mujer de Caguana or Semi, and many others. Taino women played a very important role in the society, economically as well as culturally. They made blankets, they made hammocks, they wove baskets, and they made naguas. Naguas were like these long skirts, and we still use the word enagua for a slip. So those were worn primarily according to the woman's status. So the higher the status, the longer the skirt, and also was primarily for married women. It was a uh, whereas most of the other people basically were nude. Villages again were ruled by a cacique or a chief, and the next in line was also a matrilineal thing. There was the eldest son of the sister of a deceased cacique, and also Taina women became caciques. So the woman did play an important role. One example of that has been recorded, and there are also some stories about her, is Cacica Luisa, who actually was married to Pedro Mejias, who was a free black man. He traveled with Ponce de Leon, who was sent to colonize Puerto Rico. And it is said that she lived in the region near Luisa, which is, and in Loíza Aldea, which is where the name Loíza Aldea comes from Luisa. This is a picture that shows the encounter and the many different trips that were taken by the Spaniards initially. Before this are Colon's trips, the first, second, third, and fourth trip, according to the colors. You could see them here. And Puerto Rico was in, the encounter with Puerto Rico was on the second trip, 1493. And you could see a picture here of Columbus, or a drawing of him with the Tainos. At first, as I said, they were very welcoming and friendly, and until they found out that they were in for a little bit of a surprise. And this timeline indicates some of the key points in our history relative to the Spanish, from the time that Columbus arrived through Ponce de Leon, who of course everybody knows because he went to Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth, but he was first the governor of Puerto Rico, sent to colonize it. The Spanish were very interested in colonizing and putting the flag of Spain and colonizing not only Puerto Rico, but all of the other territories. And of course, as they learned about other areas like Mexico and Peru and others, Puerto Rico took on less and less importance. We were mostly for trade, like Cuba and the Dominican and Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic and Haiti are today. We have that trade route. They would stop for water and other provisions and then go on. But there were efforts eventually to, especially as there was unrest beginning in other parts of Latin America, to colonize and populate Puerto Rico more. They sent Alejandro O'Reilly, who was a Spaniard of Irish descent, to implement economic reforms and to increase Spanish immigration. And then later there was a Cédula de Gracias, which increased the immigrants from many other countries that were Catholic, so France, Corsica, Ireland, others. So long as they were loyal to Spain, they were able to get land and to start developing, particularly in the area of agriculture, which is something they were very interested in. Eventually, the United States becomes a major trade partner with Puerto Rico and Cuba and begins to see the value of it. And eventually, of course, we see that it leads to the Spanish-American War. But in the meantime, we see that along with the movement to increase the population, we see an increase in slavery. And so then we begin to see some of the Spaniards, the Spanish Criollo descendants, that they wanted to do away with slavery. So you have Julio Vizcarrondo, who was a Spaniard, who was an abolitionist, and there are many others like the Dances and the Hostos, who also sought independence as Puerto Ricans began to feel more like a nation separate from Spain. Grito de Lares then was that famous call for freedom when we have a flag and our national anthem was born, and it's very important to us. But of course, while they were able to to be independent for a very, very short amount of time, the Spanish were able to crush that rebellion. And despite this, Puerto Ricans continued to conspire to break away with Spain, along with Cuba, from New York primarily, because by this time, Puerto Rico and Cuba were really the only two colonies left of all that huge Spanish kingdom that was Latin America and parts of Central and North America as well. In the effort to keep Puerto Rico, they created a charter of autonomy in 1897, which gave Puerto Rico a lot more freedom, and we even had our own money um, and stamps and everything else. But the U.S. interests and the collision with Spain caused the Spanish-American War, and so we then became a territory of the United States. But there are many remnants throughout as we go through this exploration and these land grants and the growing of sugar and coffee and bananas, and later rum was made from the sugarcane, and very popular things, of course, that we know of today, like Coquito and piña colada and all the things that we love that are made with rum. And to sugar, that was really one of the most important things, because sugar was like money and gold in those days. Everybody in Europe wanted sugar. So we see that then that increase in the immigrants came from various countries, but from Spain, it was primarily from the Canary Islands, the Balearic Islands, Palma de Mallorca, also Andalusia, Galicia, and Catalonia. And because of we come from those areas, our accent is more like those of the Canary Islanders and the south of Spain, Andalusia. Again, this merging of people and cultures began to create a sense of nationality that was very different from Spain. So we see remnants, of course, that are still very much alive today. The architecture, Puerto Rico was a walled city to try to ward off pirates that were coming from the Netherlands, the Dutch pirates, the English pirates as well. And so much of our architecture in Old San Juan and in Ponce and all is very much of Spanish, has a Spanish flavor. We have the escudo or seal, which is, related to Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen who gave Columbus the support he needed to start that exploration. Our foods have a strong influence from Spain, our dances and music, very much so, which we'll learn about more, our instruments. And then, of course, we have this wonderful story of how the women played a role in our culture. For example, that picture I just showed you has to do with a legend that when British troops surrounded San Juan in the late 1700s, the townswomen went with this bishop around with torches and praying. And when the British Navy saw that it was all lit up, they thought that there was a Spanish military, so they left. And so the women in that case played a really important role. And so La Rogativa is an important statue that you see when you're in Puerto Rico. An important woman that we can recognize of Spanish descent is Lola Rodriguez de Tio. She was a suffragist and an abolitionist. She was an independentista as well, and authored the Borinqueña. Very strong, very literate. She was an author. But women played various different roles. Some, of course, were outstanding, like her, but these Spanish women brought in their language and customs, crafts, agriculture, the foods, and as we'll see later, sewing and embroidering. But there were other women that came in from other European areas, like from Corsica, France, Ireland, Germany. And they were also instrumental in helping with tobacco, cotton, sugar. And they intermarried with the population and adopted the language and customs, but they still influenced it and the foods and the arts. So two examples of that are Mariana Brasetti, who was of Corsican descent, and she was an independentista who created our first. She created our first flag, and we have Edna Cole, who was of Irish descent, and she helped to found the Fine Arts Academy in Puerto Rico. You could see the flag that Brasetti designed on the bottom right. It's lattice flag, but it looks very much like the Dominican flag because they were using that as the example for designing it, the independence flag of lattice. We get to African slavery and freedom. This is a really important and marked period of our history. We can see that in the timeline from the very beginning, we had free blacks that came with Columbus and with Ponce de Leon as well. By 1508, enslaved blacks were brought in from Africa, and there are examples of how the Black and Taino initially came together to revolt. Um, so we see that in Puerto Rico also, besides having enslaved Africans, there were always free blacks. So you could look down the timeline that almost 2 to 1 by 1673 of free blacks to enslaved Africans. And still the slave revolts came about. There was resistance from the Spanish through La Banda contra la Raza Africana. The Abolition Society kept growing in order to end slavery. And the Moray law meant that any child who was born even to slaves would be free. So by 1873, slavery was abolished. And you could see lots of efforts to promote more equality, something that goes on till today, such as the League to Promote the Advancements of Blacks. So we see, a timeline of struggle. The first Africans that, came also in some cases were working to help the Spaniards. But then as the need increased and the Tainos were killed off, they began participating in the slave trade to bring in Africans to do the work. So primarily they came from the Western Sudan, the Mandinga tribes, and the groups from Senegal and Gambia, the Gold Coast. You have the Yoruba and the Igbo. So people from Nigeria, so many different people. I think one of the things that was different about the Africans in Puerto Rico is that the families were allowed to stay together, and so they could recreate some of their cultural elements, which is unlike the United States, where on purpose families were separated and it was very difficult to maintain those ties. But the Spanish also, along with Tainos, integrated. So you had a variety of skin tones and hair texture, and the Spanish were very race conscious. So they had like a caste system. Depending on the color of skin and hair, that would determine your social and economic worth. And so it's almost like it became a thing to mejorar la raza. You had to marry up to white because why? Because whites got a better break at life and got social status. Not that there was inequality in any other way, but it was a way of trying to, get some land and participate in all of the economy as best as possible. So it was always a struggle, but despite that racism, there were lots of advances and cultural contributions. One example is Jose Campeche, who was born free. His father was a freed slave and his mother was from the Canary Islands. And because she was European, her children were born free. He was classified as a mulatto, and he became one of the most important painters of that period. Of the late 17, in the 1800s, particularly in late 1700s. So that spirit to fight for freedom, independence, to fight racism, to preserve culture, really, we can say in some regard came from, those individuals who came with that yearning to struggle for equality, that knowing that culture is inseparable with our language and cuisine and religion and people, that this became an integral part of Puerto Rican culture. There was a Spanish Creole called Bozal that we don't hear very much today, and some of those intonations affected our language. Also the foods that we know and love, like Mofongo, alcapurria, and you'll learn more a little bit later, that come really from the roots are from Africa, and the dances that we'll learn about more. The religion, of course, was also integrated, much like the Christians did everywhere, where saints would then represent African gods. So we see that merging of African culture and the reflections and everything in our foods, in our dances, in our art. And, we can see that here's an example of individual who's a teacher, who is very, very important, who is Rafael Cordero, whose sister was Celestina Cordero. And she actually was a teacher just like him, but we always hear about Rafael Cordero as like the father of education, but she was really a pioneer in education for women. She started the first school for girls in San Juan, and she took girls of regardless of race or class. She was really important to the development of education, which of course was limited primarily to the elite and mostly males. But women in general played a very important role introducing, as I mentioned earlier, the dances and the foods, but also they played an instrumental part in the economy and helping with the farming, as well as in some cases they were maids or nannies. So we see that this evolution of women, this idealized version of a woman started to evolve, of a woman of mixed races, known as morena, mulata, trigueña, café con leche, all these words that define a woman who's sort of blended. We're very proud of that, mixed with African, with European and Taina features. And, that has actually led to Puerto Ricans being considered, some women being considered the most beautiful, winning many Miss Universe contests and Miss World contests. And we also hear about these beautiful women in the lyrics of popular music and in the media. So that's a legacy that we have. But, we're not just about beauty, we got brains too. So we have the outstanding Boricua women throughout history in every walk of life, in the arts, in literature, in sports, and science. And we can just see some very few examples, because there are many, many more. We have Antonia Pantoja, who is an activist, and she developed many organizations to help people in New York and in Puerto Rico. Esmeralda Santiago on the right, upper right, who was an author, very famous Puerto Rican author. Rita Moreno, of course, who's a very famous actress, who has won many different awards. I put here garment worker, because that represents many of our moms. That was my mom, and they played an essential role, not only in the garment industry in Puerto Rico, but in New York as well, in other major cities. Julia de Burgos, a famous poet, who also dealt with lots of racial bias and produced an amazing poetry. Antonia Novello, who was Surgeon General, and of course the Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So there's just a few examples of women who have contributed to society and are Puerto Rican. And so now Sonia is going to share with you a little bit about our music and dance. Sonia? We can't hear you, Sonia.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay.
Everyone. I'm sure you've heard this saying, Puerto Ricans are born dancing, and there's a reason behind it, because it's in our blood, going back to the Tainos. And hopefully in the next few slides, I'll be able to cover with you how the instruments and dances evolved. Okay, there were different countries, and and I went over some of the history of that, but there were different countries and continents that contribute to the instruments that to create musical sound and that special beat that you have of the Latino culture. Some of the instruments were the guidos, the maracas. I have some here, and some maracas. There was the cuatro, you can see the picture there on the screen. There was the tipe, there was the pandereta. I think I have one of here. And there was the bongo, there was the palitos. And I'm gonna get a little more into the guido and how it was made. So the guido and the maracas were made from the fruit of it's called a higuera bush, or it's a gourd, and it looks like this, kind of like this. And what they would do is they would empty it out and set it out to dry, punch holes in them, and then actually then build the instrument. The guido, which I have one here, if you could see it, was an elongated shape and stripes, and then they had the little edge on it so I could give it that scratchy sound that we're all familiar with. And the maracas were also made of the wood, and some of them were made, but of course they had a different type of a shape. And actually, I think Anita had, yeah, she mentioned here, we had made it, even some of these instruments are now being made, sadly enough, in plastic, and I actually have one, which I'm gonna put away. And today they are made of different materials, ranging from wood to plastic, and have become very stylized. So they get very creative, like this one. I have another set that actually has all the carving on the wood. That's okay. So the Arenito Taino, the Arenito is a word for song. And I can't see the rest of the screen here, so let me get over here. I can't see the right side of the screen. Let's see. I'll have to read from here. The Arenito Taino word is a word for song and was dominant with instrumental music and dances connected to religion and local history. The maracas were also used in religious chants and ceremonies. One of the most important gifts of the Taino could give was a song, and it was also that was linked to the spirit world. The Arenito dancing developed in the batey, a ceremonial square cleared in large areas. At first, the area was a large area like that. And then if you remember some of the slides that were shown originally with the little boyos, the smaller homes, some of them obviously were small. So people learned to actually clear out the front area of those boyos so that they could actually do their own dance and show off all the different costumes that they had. So the Jíbaro, or country folk of Puerto Rico, later continued to clear batey-like spaces from their homes. That's what I was just mentioning. Sorry, I'm missing the right quarter of the screen now. So I'm reading from an actual printout. So the Spanish settlers, is there a way that I could get these people, I mean, I could get us off the right? I'll move the
Of the what?
yeah, I can't see the right side of the presentation.
Oh,
Yeah, you can take the full pictures of us and kind of with your drag it up to the, you can drag it up if you want to.
yeah, and move.
Yeah, but I have to drag it. It doesn't drag that way. Okay, I'll continue reading. I actually printed it out, so that's okay. So I'll have to read. So Spanish settlers from Andalusia, Spain, with Moorish influence, brought the seis music and dance. The band was a guitar, the cuatro, and the triple, and the guiro. Jíbaro music was a musical expression of the humble mountain people working coffee plantations and farms. Entonces, we have the aguinaldo, which was used primarily during the Christmas time. And in the churches, people would gather and do parrandas with family and friends, and they would travel from house to house, and they would get food, and as their gift, they would sing the aguinaldo to them. Melodies and improvised lyrics are also from seis decima fold poetry, start using 10 lines. So they would create 10 lines and tell a story. Together. Okay, now I can see it. Okay, Spanish, of course, we were talking about the Spanish or the European influence. So different string instruments were popular, as was the accordion. They were made from wood. The cuatro, which is of course one of our most famous one, and the triple guitars are most authentic. The cuatro evolved from 4 double strings to 5 double strings. So it made a high-pitched sound like a mandolin. The cuatro accompanies acoustic guitar, and the triple, which was a smaller string instrument. Although it was used in folk-style Jíbaro music, the cuatro became popular with musicians like Joe Motoro in New York, Willie Colon Orchestra during the golden age of the salsa. And I'm going to go a little bit into that later on. El triple actually the one that's on the right-hand side, right, that's the 19th century Puerto Rican tiple, and it's in the Theodore Vidal collection, is in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And here we're going to give you a little sample of what the tipe sounded like. It's an old recording of the Puerto Rican Institute of Culture. The troubadour Maria Esther Acevedo sings an aguinaldo. And it's backed by a tiple. Go ahead.
Everybody can dance.
Thank you, Anaida, a musical technician. Okay, so we're going to begin with the danza. Danza was considered ballroom dancing. It was influenced in Europe and Latin American countries, but as they came into Puerto Rico, they came in with like the minuet from France, and of course the danza became very, very popular. The waltz style dance was enjoyed by mostly the elite. It evolved from contradanza and other forms, and it was performed in a pattern after a stroll around the room, and then it would be like 4 steps in like a square. They would have like a little square, little piece added to it. Juan Morel Campos, which is the gentleman on the right of your screen, or maybe it's on the left of your screen, was known as one of the best composers of danza puertorriqueña. The pandereta, the bombo, and the bongos are also made by covering the round wood cylinders with animal skins. This was one of the when I was reading about the Tainos, one of the first instruments that they developed. In a smaller version, of course, this is one of the first ones. The different shapes and sizes, they affected the depth of the sound. And then these were accompanied by dancers in bomba and plena. So as you can see, the dancers on the side, the bomba is the expression of Afro-Boricuas. The drum players and the dancer communicate, and the main drum, or el subidor, bombo, follows the moves of the dancer with the beat and the melody. The dancers tell tocador drummer what to play with their moves. So she was pretty much in control. And he had to be paying attention in order to be able to continue the entire dance. It was known as the dance of the slaves, and it was originally danced in sugar plantations. In the coast was where the bomba became very popular, and it expanded in style in Puerto Rico. But what happened was that these plantations went around the coast. So as they were built around the coast of Puerto Rico, then of course it became more popular. Some of the famous bomba families was Cepeda. Then came the plena, which was a fusion of music and dance culture. So it kind of embodied everyone. It was known as the Bolinkin Dance. It originated in Ponce, Puerto Rico in the 1900s, and it was influenced by the bomba. It showed fusion with Taino and Spanish instruments, the pandereta, drums that were backed up by the guiro, guitar. And then around 1907, words and singing were added. So it took a while before but they found a very interesting way to do it. It was called the song newspaper. And it was considered for lower classes because it basically was telling a story or kind of sometimes gossip of the neighborhood. They would put it together. If you had to put something in the newspaper, this is the way they would do it. They would do the songs. So that's what was considered the song newspaper. Manuel Jimenez El Canario, which is you probably have heard of him, 1895 musician, was famous for his plena style. And then in the 1930s, the piano was introduced, horns, and the bass. And then it became really popular. And so obviously, I cannot close without talking about salsa. Cuban rhythms and plena with musicians from the Caribbean and New York's jazz scene. Picked up accents traveling through the islands, a combination of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican, and other rhythms and dance styles. The Puerto Ricans fell in love with salsa and made it popular in the clubs of San Juan in New York in the 1950s into the 70s. There was the cha-cha-cha, the merengue, the bachata, the bolero, and of course, the famous reggaeton, which is part of the dance repertoire, but salsa continues to be the favorite music and dance of Puerto Rico. And I think it's because the steps, the turns, the foot, the maneuvers of your hands, everything is incorporated and makes it a beautiful part of the bomba, plena, and dancer, and all the other Latin styles that are incorporated together and makes this beautiful fusion of dancing. A bridge between performers in the island of New York made the genre commercial and popular among the people. These are some of the famous salsa bands, the Cortijos de Combo, Richie Ray, Bobby Cruz, El Gran Combo de Puerto Rico, that perform in Puerto Rico and New York with performers such as Celia Cruz and Cover. So till this day, salsa is the most popular style of dance in Puerto Rico. And that's it for me.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Sonia. That was very nice. So we're moving now from dance and music. We're going to see some of the arts and crafts of Puerto Rico. Where do they come? There's so many, and we're only going to highlight 3 of my favorite here. So let's start with the first one. And we will be starting with La Talla de Santos. Perfect. So before that, I'm sorry. Since the encounter of the Spaniards in 1493, Puerto Rican really, the identity reflects the fusion of all the elements brought by the Tainos, the Spaniards, and the Africans in our culture, and which is really what makes the craft of the Boricuas something that we collect and we cherish. It's the blending of these cultures. These cultural blendings, what really gives us that sense of belonging and profound pride. And most of us have something in our homes that represent that beautiful craft and arts that we have in our homes or we see in different places displayed. Many of the artists and craft people express themselves and their heritage through these different medias. And now we're going to see some of them. The next one. Perfect. So now I want to show you, actually this is one of my favorite representation of the Puerto Rican art form is Las Dos Santos. Not only because of their beautiful color, they're so cheerful, and they also represent one of the deepest value of our culture, which is the religion or the religious influence that brought by the Spaniards, and even the worshiping that were done by the Tainos and the Africans. We can say that that we believe some of the historians believe that the purpose of these little saints or santos, it really comes from the substitution of the artifacts that the Tainos and later the Africans used to worship in their own places. Bigger or the larger saints were used in churches, where the smaller saints that we see many times in our homes or even in stores out there, those were mostly used to worship at home, because churches were not as common as we have, and they're not accessible as we have now, these churches. So these little saints were used to worship at home. And the saints were also a way to convert Tainos and Africans into the Christian religion. I want to show you here some beautiful santos from the early 1500s. The top left right here, this is a beautiful representation of the santos, specifically from the 1500s. It's a Puerto Rican piece, and it's right now, it lives in the Smithsonian Museum. So it's a beautiful, you can see the color, even though it's old, it's an older piece, you see that the colors were used and very detailed in the clothing that the saints are using. The materials for the saints mostly were in wood. In Puerto Rico, they were using tropical woods like cedar and caoba sometimes as well. But also we can see saints made out of clay and other materials, not only wood. Let's see. The craftsmen, before we go into Mundillo, I just want to say something, is that the craftsmen that make these santos are called santeros, and not to be confused with the santeria, but they're also called santeros, which is it's an interesting thing. And I just want to mention one last thing. In the bottom, you see the three kings there, the colored ones. Those are more modern representations of these pieces. And you can see that some of them have small pieces that are icons that represent the saint that are carrying them. These are more modern, sophisticated forms of the santos. All right, now we can move into another beautiful representation of the arts and craft of Puerto Rico is the Mundillo. And contrary to La Talla de Santos, el Mundillo, it's crafted mostly by women, whereas the Santos Talla is crafted mostly by men. So you have a big difference there of who's carrying the traditions there. Even today, we see not that many women carving santos, but we see most women doing the Mundillo. So Mundillo, I actually, when I began this project, I didn't know what was the difference between Kahe and Mondijo, and basically they are the same thing, and it's just a form of Encaje. These were the Mundillo or Encaje was brought by the Spaniards and later through other Europeans that immigrated and settled in Puerto Rico. And I want to talk about the Mundillo, specifically how it's made, because it's a beautiful product that we have. But we can see the instruments that we use. So Anaida, if you can take it to the next, I want to show them here on the top. You see here, this is the instrument that is made, that is used to create the lace. And so on the top we have a pillow, and that's the name. That is named actually Mundillo. The pillow where the lace is made, it's what we call Mundillo. We also use the bobbins here, and these are the pencil-like tools that are used to do the lacing and to create the designs on top of the Mundillo. So this is actually from the Museum of Mundillo in Moca, that beautiful instrument right there. Another thing that I want to mention is that Mundillo, there are many type of lace, and Mundillo, we can have different endings. We have some of the endings of the lace can be straight, and some have puntilla. That's why we call them puntilla. That's another thing that I wanted to mention. In this picture, we have a beautiful representation of the lace, and this is Miss Puerto Rico 2015, and it's all, her dress is all made of beautiful Mundillo lace. All right. And finally, when we talk about arts and craft in Puerto Rico, I'm sure you all can think, when you close your eyes, you think about the traditional caretas of our vejigantes. And this is a very Puerto Rican tradition. Many of us have typical caretas or caretas de vejigantes in our homes. And I want to talk a little bit about the story behind them and how they became more Puerto Rican in our tradition. So the tradition for the caretas really originated in Spain in the late, and later it was influenced by the African culture here in Puerto Rico. In the 1700s, the Spaniards celebrated their patron, Santiago, for liberating them, from the Moors. And that's how we see in these celebrations, men with caretas. They were carrying long poles with inflated cow bladders, and they would hit sinners along the celebration and to drove them back to church. And that's how we have our vejigantes. And the name vejigante is it's a compound of two words, vejiga and gigante. And that's where we have that combination of that monster that we see in the celebrations of the carnivals with the vejigas, or the inflated cow bladders. They're supposed to be used to hit people, bring them back to church. So that I found that very, very colorful kind of story there. The fangs of the vejigante that we see today really kind of were more influence of the African culture, where we can see the long horns, and then we see the caretas with fangs. And maybe we can go to one of the next picture to kind of show that. So these caretas here, they're really the blending of the cultures with the African influence, with the horns and the fangs that we see today in our caretas of the vejigantes. And the African representation really was the struggle between the good and evil, and that's why these máscaras have this very terrifying effect on people. All right. Just to close here, the máscaras are mostly made of papier mâché or coconut shells. So I hope you enjoyed these beautiful artifacts.
Thank you, Marjorie. Good evening. My name is Gloria San Miguel, and I will be talking to you tonight about the influences to Puerto Rican Spanish. The way that the Spanish language is spoken in Puerto Rico is very unique, fast, fun, and vibrant, full of the joy that characterizes most Puerto Ricans. And like we heard during the presentation, there are four main influences to the way people talk in Puerto Rico: the Taino influence, the Spain's Spanish influence, African influence, and American influence. So there are many things that are named in Puerto Rico with native Taino terms. For example, like Boricua, Taína, Cacique, Achote, Hamaca, Huracán, Enagua, Coquí, Canoa, Iguana, y Tiburón. A lot of terms in the geography, like the names of the towns, Aguadilla, Mayagüez, Humacao, El Yunque, they all come from the Taino influence. Also foods or things we used to cook, like barbacoa, cacao, tobacco, guayaba, yuca, guanábana, papaya, maíz, maní, and The architecture, of course, bohío and el batey. The Spanish settlers, as we also mentioned before, came mostly from the Canary Islands and the Andalusia regions. That is why many of our words and pronunciations resemble their way of talking and pronouncing. For example, the way we replace the R for the L, for example, we say aló instead of arroz or Puerto Rico instead of Puerto Rico. Also, we change the ending of the words and we replace it with an AO. For example, the word hablado, we would say hablao. We also have words that even though they come from Spanish, from Spain, they have an Arabic influence because of the 800 years of the Moorish control in Spain. Some words are azul, lápiz, almohada. Also, there's other languages that are spoken in some regions of Spain, like Gallego and Catalan. Also, other European settlers that came from France, from Italy, Ireland. All these people and all these different languages, they affected our accent and the words. So in general, we can see the impact of Spain in our language, like in the name of the saints, San Juan, San Sebastian, objects like guitarra, the feelings like amor or muerte, names of food like arroz, carne, pescado, or the way we name the livestock, vaca, caballo, puerco. And on the architecture, casa, edificio, el balcón, el morro. The African influence, well, the people that came from Africa, they came mostly from the regions of Central Africa or the Congo region and Western Africa, which is also the Yoruba region. There's lots of words that we use to name different things like chango, changuería, que bochinche, el baquiné, bembeteo, chévere, ñangotao, mongo, mongoya, like the dances and music like merengue, mambo, bomba, bongo, and the foods like guineo, mango, guingambo, gandules, sancocho, mondongo, mofongo, ñame. The influence from the United States started showing in 1898 when Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States. So now there are many words in English that are used daily in Spanish, as well as new words that are Anglicisms that have been created. For example, people say, voy pa'l shopping center, or está by the book. Or we can say, vamos a janguear. And janguear comes from the word hang out. So all these influences have created this unique Spanish that is so colorful and that represents us. And that takes me to the next section. We're going to talk about proverbs and sayings. So now I would like to invite all of you, if you wish, to go to the chat and write a favorite dicho or saying that maybe your mama, your tia, tu abuela used to say, and it's very meaningful to you, okay? But first, while you do that, I'm gonna talk about some words or phrases that when we say them, people turn around and say, tú eres boricua. So let's see some examples here. The word boricua, that means it's an indigenous word and it means that we are Puerto Rican. Ay bendito. People recognize Puerto Ricans for the ay bendito. Oh blessed. And that means when we feel sorrow or empathy for others, which is most of the time. Zafacón is a trash can. La monga es el flu. Guame, it's something very easy. El Jurutungo or Las Cinsoras is a place very far away. Tú eres mi pana means you're my friend. Un bembetero is a person who loves to gossip. Hincho is a very white person. Chavar, deja de chavar means don't bother me. Se me fue la guagua, that means the boss. Qué chévere, qué chulo, that means cool, nice. But lo voy a hacer ahorita. Ahorita means for us later. For Mexicans, it means the opposite, which is now. And another one is that China China, it's of course an orange. The word China, it's a trade route. It comes from from China, because the naranja, the sweet orange, it originates from China. So that's why La China, instead of, in Puerto Rico, instead of assimilating the word or taking the word China, they took the word China, and in other countries, they took the word naranja, but it's because it comes from China. And I hope you're thinking of your life lesson from your abuelitas, Proverbs and Sayings. So please write some so we can tell them out loud here. Some other phrases that are very Puerto Rican are, for example, say, tengo la mancha de plátano. That means you're Puerto Rican. Or if you say, soy de aquí como el coquí, also that means I am Puerto Rican. If someone tells you that they put you like a chupa de China, that means that they were reprimanded. Si te dicen que tienes la pata alzada o que eres un pati caliente, that means that you're restless and you never take a break. No juegues con mis habichuelas, that means don't take away my earnings or my job away. Como cucaracha en baile de gallina, that means that you're feeling very out of place. But if you're like el arroz blanco, that means you're very popular and you're everywhere, because we all know that Puerto Ricans, we eat everything with arroz blanco. So let me see, has anyone shared a proverb or a dicho? Ay, there's some here. Let's see.
Yes, Dorian mentioned al que a buen árbol se arrima, buena sombra le cobija.
Ajá.
Dime con
Okay.
quién andas y te diré quién eres.
Gracias, Dorian. Esa es mi hermana. Al que buen árbol se arrima, buena sombra le cobija. Muy bien. Vamos a ver. El que tiene Congo tiene de Carabalí. Ah, y también el término la mosquita muerta. Una mosquita muerta es alguien que se hace bobito, pero de bobito no tiene nada. Someone that is very smart. It seems like they don't do anything, but they would. La piña está agria. Oh my God, that's awesome. La piña está agria means that things are getting tough.
Yeah.
I love it.
There's one PTS 79's me cago en, I've heard this my whole life. Mostly from my grandmother. Me cago en na is really what she's saying here. And I maybe PTS 79 is from the same area of Puerto Rico I'm from. I was born in Vieques and grew up in Culebras. So me cago en na is it's like son of a bitch.
There you go.
So yeah, I'm sure. So I get that. So.
Very good. I see Ana V. ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Oh yeah, we all know that that means that we all have a little bit of African ancestry on all of us. So don't make like you're so white, because ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Oh yes. Let's see what else. Oh, Nilsa, that's very Puerto Rican. Vete pa'l cara.
Yeah. I heard that one a lot too.
And my other friend, Liseli. Hi, Liseli. Camarón que se duerme, se lo lleva la corriente. That means that the shrimp that falls asleep, the current takes him away.
And you know what carajo is? Like a lot of people say, oh, is it hell? Or no, carajo was actually on the big ships. It was the very, very top place where there was a little seat. And if you were punished, if you were on a voyage and you were punished, that's where they would put you, all the way up there. So when they would say vete pa'l carajo, it's like go all the way up there. So you'd be, it's like isolating.
So it's not a bad word. There you go.
It really wasn't, but we take it, that way. Right?
There you go. Ana, la madre de los tomates. The mother of the tomatoes, huh? I love it. Mi hermana Dorian vuelve y dice, no juegues con fuego, porque el que juega con fuego, ¿verdad que se quema? Oh, yes. And I'm going to say one that my mom used to say a lot. My mom used to say que el que no tiene dinga, tiene mandinga. And that's one of my favorite. Oh, and Josefa, está brutal. Oh yeah, that's my kids. When I go with my kids to Puerto Rico, they come out, está brutal. Está brutal. Very good. Well, thank you all for sharing your favorite sayings or proverbs. We have a list here that you can maybe look later when we post the presentation. And let's see, with that, I conclude my section and I will pass it on to Anaida.
Okay, thank you so much. That was fun. We have such a great culture. We're so proud of our culture. We can see that through this presentation, how all of the different cultures that have come to our shores, being an island, you get a lot of people from a lot of places, and we've blended in a very particular way. And so we've received many people from many places, very accepting. In about a year, you're a Puerto Rican. It's not like other places where you could be. Sometimes some people say you're in the United States for, centuries and you're still not accepted. But in Puerto Rico, as soon as you're there, it's a very accepting culture. But we've also been one of resistance, keeping our language and making sure that nobody takes that away, no matter after over 100 years of being a territory of the United States, we still insist on speaking Spanish. So there's been that resistance and that sense of nationality, and also adapting in many ways to create a way of life that is uniquely Puerto Rican, with our foods, our dancing, our culture, our way of behaving. And we think that for us, as the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women, we see ourselves as cultural workers and keepers, and the woman usually takes that role, many times takes that role to pass on those traditions and those cultural traits that we value so much. And we're just so proud that we were able to be with you tonight, and thank you for staying with us for this long, to be able to hear our stories. And we hope that you continue to connect and contribute to our conversation. Now that we'll turn it over to Marie, who will see if there are any questions from the participants. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us tonight.
Yeah, this is a great presentation. We did I'm glad everybody seemed to have enjoyed themselves. There was one question from PDS 79. It was near the very beginning, Anaida. It wasn't, they had a question about, did two men married Cacica Yuisa?
Right. I was, the tradition that I know of, the Tainos, is that the men had multiple wives.
Okay.
So it would not be unusual for if Yuisa, was married, that she would be understanding there might be other wives in the life of her husband. But I don't know that history. I would have to really research that a little bit more. But the women in Taino culture, sometimes, there were multiple, the caciques particularly had multiple wives, and they were even buried with the husband. When their husband died, they were buried alive. I actually saw burial sites when I was in the Dominican Republic, where they showed that the women, had been buried alive and were, trying to breathe. So the woman in that case was very subdued and subjugated to the male. But as far as Juisa herself, I'm not sure.
That was the only question that that was posted. So that's
Marie, you said you might have a few questions for us, or?
No, that was it. That was the one that came through. I don't see any in the chat.
Did you have some questions for us yourself?
Well, my big interest is language, and so one of the many things that I appreciate about this particular presentation is that I came here when I was so young. Came here when I just turned 6, and so it took me a few years to get comfortable enough to speak English and Spanish. So I kept the language in order to sort of help me with acculturation. But I left Puerto Rico so young that I only have memories of where I grew up, which was in Culebra. So I don't have the acculturation that happens in schools where you learn songs and a little bit of the history and all of those things. And the Spanish that I speak is very much from the island, off of the island. So I, these types of presentations actually help me sort of fill in these cultural blanks that I have as well. So that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this. And the language piece is important because
Yeah. Yeah. The language is
yeah, it is because it carries with it so much meaning. I like the word ahorita, which is, I always knew it as later on. But in other forms of Spanish, it means right now.
like in Mexico.
And right. And that was that was a word that I have a distinct memory of having like a cultural miscommunication with someone because I said, yeah, te lo agarro después o te lo agarro ahorita. And then I didn't move. And then the person is looking at me like, why aren't you going? It's like, because I said ahorita. And they said, no, ahorita for me means like right now, I need it right now. It's like, oh, okay, because for me it means I can get it to you later. Language has so much meaning, and I'm not a big language police person. People don't have to learn the language to be considered Puerto Rican. But for me personally, language is such a vessel for culture and history that I make every effort to stay as fluent and literate in the language as I can, because I don't have the lived experience of living in Puerto Rico. So the language is really my only bridge to the culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the songs, all the music, the words, the lyrics, all of that, becomes integral. So having that cultural link through the language is so important, even though there are people who still, of course, feel very, very Puerto Rican and have lost some of the language because of distance, or perhaps their third generation, or we have lots of different situations in which people have lost their home language or heritage language, but the cultural traits are still there, but they still may know, for example, about the foods, and they'll still say pasteles or arroz con gandula because they remember those words. I had a choir teacher who was from Hawaii, and actually Grisel is on the line. She's lived in Hawaii many years. But I remember her grandmother was Puerto Rican, and she didn't speak Spanish, but she remembered certain words and terms that her grandmother used to say. And she would ask me, and like she would say, pastiles, I love pastiles. Do you make those, or do you make serenata? And she just remembered certain things. But the one that was the funniest for me was, she asked me, goes, do you know what the word bine means? And I said, bine. And I remember my grandmother, like the people a long time ago would say, ay virgen, or ay bine. And so she was, ay virgen. She would say, ay bine, because she remembers her grandmother saying that. So there are certain things that just stay no matter how many generations down the line, people will remember. And I think that's a credit to, many times, to the moms, of course, to the dads too, but especially to the moms, who are the ones who typically carry that language and bring it forth. But we have a couple of comments.
Yeah.
Minerva from Portland.
We have 3 questions.
Oh, we have some questions. And I just wanted to say that Michelle Foley said that both her parents were born in Puerto Rico, but she was raised American. And I'm not sure if that means that she was raised in English, but she was very curious and wanted to learn more. So she was thankful. And do you have some questions, you say?
Yeah, and one other comment from Zoe: as a New Eurekan, these types of presentation helps them learn about their ancestral history. So this is a good public service that we're providing. But yes, Dorian had a question: to what do you attribute the fact that despite Puerto Rico being a U.S. Commonwealth for so long, we still preserve a lot of Spanish influence in our food, traditions, and culture?
I mean, anyone can answer. I know how I feel about that. I think that there were many attempts to change the language from Spanish to English, and Gloria can talk about that as well. But I think that was such an important integral part. It was 400 years of being under Spanish rule, and to try to shake that language, I mean, that's almost like stripping one of everything, because the language is so tied in to the identity. And so I think it was a fight. It was a sign of nationality, and people really resisted. So there was a question, and about that, both Spanish and English are official languages in Puerto Rico. So we school the children learn in Spanish, but there are bilingual schools too, and children do learn English from the time they start school, and by the time they're in secondary school, high school, and college, many of the classes and books are in English. So people do grow up to be bilingual, but the home language and the language of communication amongst the people still continues to be Spanish.
And
And
Anaida, I feel like it's worth mentioning what we were saying yesterday, talking about that there were attempts to change the language through the institution of schools. And apparently, which I didn't know, there was a big, well, of course, the result is that there was a big pushback from everybody, including the teachers who were unequipped and they didn't have the learnings, the skills to really teach in English. So the
yes,
Spanish remained as the focus of education.
as a matter of fact, there was, I think Gloria mentioned to us that it was about 40 years of imposing English in the schools until one day people got so tired, they just went on strike. The teachers, the parents, the kids, everybody went and said, we're not going to go, because the teachers would have to try and teach in English and then go out in the under the trees and teach the lessons. And so finally they reinstituted Spanish as the language of instruction, with English as a second language continued throughout. So the kids eventually learn both, but there was that resistance. I think there are two more messages.
Well, Nilsa just wrote in the chat that she wrote a book chapter on this topic. So Nilsa, maybe you want to write the name of the book in the chat, because that would be an interesting topic for so those who want to research more. Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah, and I think Nelsa's book has to do with when people lose that language, what happens to them and their sense of identity, and how, if
Interesting.
I remember correctly.
Yeah, and Anna, Spanish is not the official language of Puerto Rico.
Yeah,
There isn't, huh?
there is Spanish and English are both.
Yeah, it's Spanish and English. It's a truly bilingual place. So if anybody sort of runs into someone who doesn't speak quote unquote English, they do, or at least they can get by, and you're just not being very nice to them, so they're not going to speak English to you.
Or sometimes
That's really the bottom line.
the younger people tend to know more. They've been in school.
Sure,
People
yeah.
might still, yeah.
No, but it's truly a bilingual island, yeah.
Yeah, and the more educated a person is, likely the more English they'll know, because they'll be in more time in school learning in English, right?
Mhm.
Gloria, did you have any comments on that?
Well, I want to mention that Nilsa put the name of her book, Bilingualism in Puerto Rico, Social, Culture, and Political Perspectives, some interesting book to read. No, and about what you just mentioned about the schools and being in English, it was about 48 years that they could not give one class in Spanish except Spanish, that all the other classes, and if you think of rural Puerto Rico in 1902, nobody knew English. So I mean, for 40 years this happened. I'm sure that had to influence the way Spanish was spoken, but it was ridiculous, and they had to put an end to that and go back to the Spanish being the main language, and go into a bilingual mode, where you go with Spanish being the main one and English being the following one.
So I think there were a couple of other comments on the question and answer.
Yeah.
Something about carro being like
That's
cajo, where we have the R being more guttural, which is true. Cajo. And some people say that was, I mean, there are different theories. Some say it was from the French, others say it was from the Gallegos, who when they say, instead of saying Robert, they say Robert. So there's, different theories about where that double R pronunciation that's so guttural comes from.
I think there's also, I mean, for me, because I live in Puerto Rico so long, I think by regions, because I grew up in the San Juana area, and we don't do that, but all my family is from the center of the island, and they all say ajo.
Ajo. And I've heard that many people do think that in being in Portugal and listening to the Portuguese, how they pronounce that double R, it is like
Mhm.
There's also a question. There was also about a question about coquito, and coquito is a uniquely Puerto Rican drink. They say it started in the sugarcane fields, where the jibaritos would combine the rum with coconut milk, and that was kind of the way it initially started. But then they later on added other ingredients, and so it evolved. Kind of like la piña colada too, is a Puerto Rican, authentic Puerto Rican drink. And then I think there's one more message. Also with the letter L. Yeah, the letter L as like we use to
Aló,
replace the R.
aló, no come aló.
So I don't know if there are any more comments or oh, Q&A. Did I see that right? That there are a couple more comments or questions, or am we pretty much?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Um, Yeah, I think to respond again to Dorian Montalvo, who asked about attributing the fact that besides, despite being under the U.S. for so long, we still have, so much of our Spanish influence in food and traditions. Again, I think it's because we have 400 years to cement that culture and make it really solid, even though, people eat Burger King, all over. There's a Burger King and a Church's Fried Chicken in every corner when you're, going down the freeway. So I think there is that influence, but the original, authentic, development of the culture was slow and evolved and cemented in our DNA, I think. So, and somebody is asking, are there Taino words used? Yeah, I think Gloria mentioned mostly the names of places, right?
There's lots of colloquial words, but el bembe,
No, that's the African, the Taino she meant.
oh, Taino words. Well,
Yeah.
the name Caguas, some names of, Caguas, yeah.
And articles like we were saying, barbacoa, hamaca, canoa, the canoe. And actually those words, by the way, influenced world language because a lot of those words were adapted. The Tainos were taken to Spain. So a lot of those words, as they also learned them and used the products also and the practices, they began to adapt the language. So not only from Puerto Rico and the Arawak language, but Nahuatl and Mexico and all those words like tomato and potato and all those words, which the potato actually came from Peru, but they all have indigenous roots from different parts of the Americas and now are worldwide used, because of their indigenous origin. So, well, I hope that we've been able to respond to your questions. Oh, somebody said, PTS said Trinidad and Tobago has a similar drink for Christmas called punch and cream. I'm sure that they're like some people say, oh, coquito is kind of like eggnog, So there are a lot of variations throughout the world, of course, of different drinks that have been introduced, and we'd have to do a lot of research where did they originate. It might have been Spanish since they had colonized. It could be the Spanish colonized Trinidad and Tobago, and the Spanish were strong. They had what we consider, hegemony. They imposed the culture, the religion, the language, and so they're strong influence. And the last question: where is the origin of mofongo? That's African too.
That's African, yeah.
Mofongo, and in Cuba it's fufu, and in Dominican it's mango, and they're variations of mashed banana, all different ways. So that with delicious seasonings to go along with them. So yeah. So if there aren't any more questions or comments from the panel, closing words from the panel, Sonia?
Yes, I have something. It kind of relates to we were talking, not in relation to that particular marriage that somebody had asked you about, but Tainos in general, yes, they practice polygamy. What I found interesting that the women also practiced it too. So it wasn't just that the men could have multiple.
there we
Puerto
go.
Rican women could have multi-husbands. Some of the men had as many as 30 wives. So, you know, of course, the part that I found interesting is that the women could do it too at that time. It was okay, you know.
No, equal,
It's
equal.
almost like it's funny because you figure, God, it's supposed to be so conservative. The men really were the ones that were in charge, but yet a woman can have a couple of husbands.
And I think the caciques also took special, the
The
chiefs.
cacique was the ones that had the 30, yeah,
They
30
were the
wives.
ones
Yes.
that could really
That's true.
practically do almost anything, I guess, and it was okay. Anyone else? Well, thank you. We got a lot of thank you, Nilsa. Dr. Nilsa Torso says this was fabulous. Anavi, women were the gatherers, so they gathered their men.
There you go.
That was from Anavi. That makes a lot of sense. So we'll start wrapping up. Thank you, all of you, for being with us tonight, and we hope that you do go on our webpage if you want to revisit this particular presentation. It should be on our website in a couple days, I guess, right? And people could go on and see it. We got a couple more messages.
Yeah, people thanking us.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you, Grisel, and Anna and everyone. And to the panelists, thank you all for all your work. It's tense, but it's exciting at the same time. I apologize for all my little interruptions. I thought I had silenced everything, but apparently not. And that's the life we lead now with technology. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you to all. And
Thank you, everybody, for being here so late in the East Coast as well.
yeah, so late in the evening, and we have such a wonderful board. I'm so thankful for all of the women who are with us tonight and who serve in their capacities to make NACOPRO a really special organization. So thank you also
Of
on
course.
my behalf, and thank you and good night. So I
Good
think we
night.
can
I'm
sign
gonna go ahead and push pause, stop.
Mhm.